previously announced. Further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 8690, the Stop Secret Spending Act of 2024. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 8690, the Stop Secret Spending Act of 2024, a bill to amend the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act of 2006 to ensure that other transaction agreements are reported to usaspending.gov and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill should be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8690 is offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purpose of further amendment. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for statement on the bill and the amendment. I support the Stop Secret Spending Act of 2024, which requires federal agencies to report complete and accurate information on usaspending.gov for how they spend appropriated funds. Since 2006, agencies have been required to be more transparent with how they are spending taxpayer dollars. The Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, and later amended by the Data Act of 2014, established usaspending.gov, a public database of all government spending. This transparency is critical because it ensures the American people that agencies are using their hard-earned money appropriately. Unfortunately, over the years, we have found that there are gaps in usaspending.gov. Agencies more and more have been utilizing authorities for contracting mechanisms known as other transaction agreements, or OTAs. OTAs are not subject to certain federal acquisition laws and requirements, and most importantly, are not required to be reported to usaspending.gov under current law. The Government Accountability Office has found that agencies use different methods to report the billions in spending related to OTAs. However, it is unknown if they are reporting consistently or if this information is even complete. That means we do not have full transparency over how billions of dollars are spent by federal agencies. This bill corrects that issue by requiring OTA spending be reported to usaspending.gov under Data Act. The bill also requires agencies to report annually on funds that previously were unreported for a variety of exemptions. Agencies will need to report the amounts and reasons why these appropriated dollars were not reported. This provides more transparency to the public and allows all of us to hold these agencies accountable. Lastly, this bill restores the requirement for agency inspectors general to review the entirety of data submitted by usaspending.gov to ensure that it is complete and accurate. Transparency does not mean anything if the information isn't complete or accurate. This bill will ensure that information will be both complete and accurate. I thank Representatives Barry Moore and Jimmy Panetta for leading this bill in the House of Representatives. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill. I now yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to Representatives Moore and Panetta for their strong bipartisan work on this bill, and to Senator Ernst for her work on the Senate companion. usaspending.gov, the official source of government spending data, is a public database of federal agencies' direct expenditures, displaying federal contract, grant, loan, and other financial assistance awards totaling more than $25,000. Prime contract recipients are required to report details on their first-tier sub-recipient awards. The website is maintained by the Department of the Treasury. It provides accurate, consistent, reliable, and searchable data so the public can trace the use of our taxpayer dollars. However, agency reporting requirements are ambiguous when it comes to reporting so-called other transaction agreements, OTAs, which are legally binding agreements that are considered different from standard federal contracts and grants. A GAO review found over $40 billion in agency OTAs from fiscal year 2020 through 2022 that were therefore not reported on usaspending.gov. H.R. 8690 would enact a GAO recommendation to require agencies to include these OTAs in their reports to usaspending.gov, taking a big step towards making the public record of federal spending far more complete. H.R. 8690 would require the DOT to report, the Treasury Department to report annually on the total federal spending on awards for which data has not been posted on usaspending.gov, as well as the reason such data has not been posted. It would implement 2 more GAO recommendations, including requiring Treasury, OMB, and other agencies to ensure that usaspending.gov data is complete and accurate, and requiring Treasury and OMB to periodically assess and determine which agencies have to report data to the usaspending.gov website. The public deserves transparency and accountability in how our tax dollars are being spent. This bill would strengthen accountability and transparency and empower usaspending.gov to further meet its mission. I encourage all of our colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Do any members seek recognition on the bill? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 8690 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs.
I request a roll call, please.
A recorded vote is ordered by Mr. Biggs. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 9040, the Taxpayer Exposure Risk Reduction Act. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 9040, the Taxpayer Exposure Risk Reduction Act, a bill to require covered agencies to issue strategy and implementation plans for the transfer of credit, guarantee, and insurance risk to the private sector, and to require the implementation of such plans and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 9040 is offered by Mr. Comer of
Without
Kentucky.
objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes on the statement on the bill. Currently, the federal government manages nearly 148 federal programs or activities that put federal agencies at risk of bearing financial losses. Inherently, these financial risks are assumed by the American taxpayer and create uncertainty when budgeting for dramatic costs arising from unpredictable covered events. Rarely do federal agencies explore the potential budgetary benefits of shifting some of these costs to the private sector, which specializes in managing these financial risks. As a result, American taxpayers are left suddenly footing the entire cost of activities ranging from managing mortgage financing to student loans to crop insurance. Mr. Donald's and Mr. Cristomorte's Taxpayer Exposure Risk Reduction Act would direct federal agencies to assess the budgetary and cost-saving potential of transferring risk to the private sector. Agencies would then publicly report the findings of these assessments. The bill would provide implementation authority for them to do so in instances where such transfers do not increase costs to the federal government or program beneficiaries. H.R. 9040 represents a creative, straightforward effort to improve government budgeting and efficiency. I thank the sponsors for introducing the bill, the sponsors, Mr. Donalds and Cristomorte, and I now recognize the ranking member for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regrettably, I've got to oppose H.R. 9040, the so-called Taxpayer Exposure Risk Reduction Act. This is a staggeringly broad and momentous bill that would make dramatic changes to how federal agencies manage financial risk, allowing public agencies to transfer credit risk to the private sector. And obviously, the private sector is not doing this on an altruistic, not-for-profit, philanthropic basis. The private sector is only going to be involved if they believe that there's profit to be made in doing this. Now, federal risk guarantees exist in a number of areas and agencies, including home mortgages, college student debt, farm business loans, small business loans, and disaster insurance. None of those areas, Mr. Chairman, are within the jurisdiction of this committee, and we haven't had a single hearing on this extremely complicated bill that could have sweeping economic and fiscal consequences, whether or not they're intended. The federal government also directly assumes risk in certain insurance programs and federal pension programs, making it the policy of the federal government to transfer credit, guarantee, or insurance risk to the private sector is a massive change and raises very complex concerns about this one-size-fits-all master approach to addressing insurance and government programs. I want to ask unanimous consent that a letter from a number of concerned groups, including Americans for Financial Reform and the Center for Responsible Lending and others, describing their concerns with this legislation to be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
The authors of the letter argue that this mandate would put Wall Street in the driver's seat in the rollout, access, pricing, and servicing of critical federal guarantee programs ranging from home mortgage lending to small business and farm loans, and could result in significantly increased costs for taxpayers and diminished or more expensive access to credit for American citizens, families, farms, and small businesses. Transferring credit risk to the private sector does not necessarily minimize the cost of such risk to the taxpayers. The private sector obviously must be compensated to accept the credit risk. And I don't think we know the first thing about the market of that risk, and we have not looked at historical analogies to doing this. In times of financial recession and stress, I know that private sector guarantors are far more likely to be unable to execute on their credit guarantees than the federal government is. Experience has shown that in times of economic stress, investors far more prefer to deal with the government, and private sector guarantors may simply fail to be able to deliver on credit guarantees. A number of striking examples of this, of course, occurred during the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis. At the very least, Mr. Chairman, I would say this is a subject that should not be rushed through in some kind of hasty way. We need to have serious hearings about this, along with the committees of substantive jurisdiction over all of the specific questions like home mortgages, college student debt, small business loans, the farm sector, and so on. So I'm not prepared to gamble on this approach right now, and I would strongly oppose H.R. 9040, the Taxpayer Exposure Risk Reduction Act. And I'm happy to yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back. I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers and Reinsurance Association of America addressed to myself and Mr. Raskin in support of the Donalds-Christomorte bill. Without objection, so ordered. Do any other members seek recognition? Chair recognizes the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Donalds from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman, for convening this important markup today. I appreciate your leadership